Hey everyone, welcome back to Here in Apologetics. Super pumped you're joining us today to have Kyle Alander, also known as Christian Idealism, where we're going to be talking about the problem of evil and how Christians can defeat it. So yeah, Kyle, thanks for joining me. How you doing?
Pretty good. Glad to be here.
I think we have a pretty ambitious target here in this video of defeating the problem of evil. So we're just going to dive right into it. So do you have any general considerations you want to talk about when we're looking at the problem of evil?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is to sort of tell a short story of how I got here, because I just to let you know, I couldn't have gotten here without other people's help. So Tim Howard is one partner of mine. We're sort of like philosophical partners, and we talk a lot on the phone about these issues. And me and him sort of work through it together. And we had to both sort of read a lot of the philosophical literature on this. I think one of the main reasons, we wanted to take a more, we wanted to be honest with the evidence, right? So the problem of evil is like the biggest objection to theism. Like if you ask any ordinary atheist or agnostic about, why they don't believe God exists or why they think, that God is not all good or something, it's going to be the problem of evil. Like the problem of evil is like the number one problem for theism, right? It's been around for thousands of years. So, this objection is not necessarily new. What is new, however, is sort of the new formalizations of the argument, right? And so, as I was looking, as me and Tim were researching this, we had to be honest with the evidence, because at first, my sort of approach prior to this was I took the approach of Clay Jones, and Clay Jones's Theodicy is, I think, pretty good for the most part when it comes to moral evil, but it's not very good when it comes to like natural evil or any other like evolutionary evils. So I had to like change my perspective, right? And so I had to like, if I wanted to be honest with the evidence, right? If I wanted to, look at the problem of evil in this sort of in the objective way possible, I had to like actually go into the literature and look at all the different versions that exist, right? Um, Early on, I started off with this. Now, these aren't just problem evil arguments. There's also other arguments, but mostly problem evil stuff, right? So most of the arguments in here are going to be problem evil arguments. And then, of course, you have J.L. Mackie, which I read this probably twice now. And, he presents his logical, the logical version, the problem evil. So I had to, my when I first started off, my sort of view was that that evil is evidence against God. That evil at least has some weight, or at least that my general sort of view that I took was, okay, evil is evidence against theism, right? And that I just thought that the evidence for theism would sort of outweigh it, right? So I took this sort of outweighing approach where it's like, okay, even if evil is like evidence against theism, it's not strong enough to like outweigh sort of the probability, right? Um, that started to change, however, when I started reading, like, there was this one paper by Robert Bass. It's called Inscrutable Evils, and he uses a Bayesian calculation. Now, just to be clear, even before this, I didn't necessarily agree with the way that he did the probabilities, but basically what his argument was that even if you gave theism a 99% probability or prior probability, that evil would still outweigh um, theism. So then basically evil, at least inscrutable evils, was sort of like the amount of inscrutable evils would be enough to sort of tip against theism, right? Now, of course, again, I don't, even before this, even before I came to the conclusion I do now, I didn't necessarily buy his argument, because I didn't really agree with the way that he did the probabilities, but I could sort of understand, like, okay, an atheist, I could see why, okay, as an atheist, you could sort of conclude, even if you have all this evidence for theism, evil would just sort of outweighs it, right? So I had to be honest, right? I had to like look into the data, I had to look into the literature. Okay, what are these philosophers saying? What are these atheist philosophers saying? And then also, what are the responses, right, from the theistic side? Right. So me and Tim, we had to like go through a lot of stuff, and there's different approaches, right? So there's Clay Jones's approach, which is a sort of Augustine theodicy. Then there's also a skeptical theist theodicy, or not a theodicy, but skeptical theism is the idea that we can't really know, right? And then there's also other sort of approaches, like the Molinist. I know William Lane Craig has done some work on the problem of evil. So there's a lot of views on this, right? There's different approaches. So we had to like be careful in how we would approach it, right? And see what is the best approach for a theist to take, right? And we wanted to make sure, I think most importantly is we wanted to make sure that, whatever answer we come up with, that it would sort of make sure that, if we had to present a theodicy, then it had to be good enough so that it would not, it would not like decrease the prior probability of the hypothesis. So basically, you don't want to like build stuff in, right? And I feel like what Clay Jones's stuff did is, I think that he has to build in a lot of stuff. So he has to build in a fall. He has to build in, sort of Christian story. I think those are very problematic, right? And so I had to look elsewhere for a sort of answer, right? And the answer that I came to was, well, I was quite surprised. Me and Tim were quite surprised when we reached this conclusion, but basically the problem of evil doesn't work at all. So it doesn't have any sort of evidential weight at all. Now I know that is an extreme position. So I know that most apologists, at least that I've seen, they sort of grant the problem of evil. So they'll say, that it can work in some sense, right? But that, the evidence for theism sort of outweighs it. My approach, at least my conclusion on this, is that the problem of evil doesn't work at all. So it doesn't even have any evidential weight at all, right? And there's a few, I give, 4 main reasons why. We'll get into those, but there are reasons why I think that. And, hopefully today I could sort of present those reasons. So yeah, I guess that's the general story. Where basically we started off with, a fall theodicy. Then we worked through the literature, and then finally we came to a point where basically it's not a problem anymore. And my conclusion now is, of course, that I don't think the problem of evil works at all, like not even in an evidential sense. So the evidential probability is just 0 at that point. I know that, again, that's an extreme position, but I had to be honest with what I was looking at, and so that's what I came to.
Yeah, it's super helpful, and I think that when we get through your points, Kyle, it does seem kind of like it's a very ambitious claim to say like the problem of evil just like doesn't work. It's a bad argument. But to do that, like really, it's important to like get into like your 4 big reasons that we'll get into a minute, because I think it's going to really help people listening and seeing this to kind of understand where we're coming from. Because obviously, I know like all my like amazing like atheist agnostic friends that may listen to this will be like, "What the heck are they talking about?"
Yeah.
But we're gonna dive into it. So, anything else you want to say before we dive into these 4 major problems?
I guess there are 2 general considerations that I want to point out here. And these are sort of what I came to when I was doing my research. So the first, I guess maybe only one general consideration, which is that we have to understand what theism actually is as a hypothesis, right? So we have to understand that theism, because it's a metaphysical hypothesis, then it should only be concerned with like fundamental facts about the world, right? And so one of those fundamental facts, at least when it comes to problem of evil, is going to be, why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur, right? It's not about, okay, well, why does God allow, hurricanes? Why does God allow pain and pleasure and evolution? Why does God, like, those are sort of macro level phenomena of the more deeper question in my mind, which is, why do bad states of affairs occur, right? Because those are all bad states of affairs, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And so, given the type of hypothesis that theism is, then the only question that a theist needs to answer, right, with the problem of evil, is, why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur, and why are there like bad properties, right? So why does God allow the badness of properties to take into a hold? So I think, that question sort of covers everything, right? So it covers, the biological role of pain and pleasure. It covers, burning fun. It covers like any sort of evil you can possibly sort of imagine is going to sort of include that general question, right? So I think if theism can answer that question, why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur, then the problem of evil just gets nullified, right? It's not a problem anymore. And it doesn't matter like what version of the problem of evil you come up with, right? So that was sort of, earlier in my journey before I came to my conclusion, that was that was one of my first sort of principles. It was like, okay, yes, there are different versions of the problem of evil, but fundamentally they're all sort of linked back to this ultimate question, which is, why does God allow bad states of affairs to occur, right? Because, I mean, it doesn't matter which version you come up with, right? Even, all the versions that exist today, and even any versions that happen, that philosophers write about in the future, is all going to come down to this, fundamental question, right?
Yeah.
So me and Tim, we sort of focused mainly on that question, right? So it didn't really matter if there were certain evils, like let's say parasites, or there's another example, which is there's teleological evils, right? So teleological evils is another example where it's like you have species that sort of their existence is to give pain to other species, right? But even in that circumstance, that's still going to boil down to that fundamental question, right? So that's just that's really the only general consideration I want to, people to keep in mind here, that when it comes to any version of small evil, it's going to really come down to that question, right? So now let's get into my 4 sort of points on the problem of evil.
Yeah,
so the first one is what I call the problem of shared axiology, right? So what does this mean? Well, I went over this in my debate, but I guess just briefly summarizing here. So in order for the problem of evil to get off the ground, it has to assume an axiology, right? It's going to have to assume a more fundamental value theory, or what I call value assumptions, or a set of value assumptions, right? And I mean, and I think this is pretty obvious. I mean, if you're gonna state, okay, there's this bad states of affairs that God would not allow, well, you're gonna have to assume an axiology there. You're gonna have to assume that these actually are bad states of affairs in the first place, right? And so, in order for the problem of evil to actually get off the ground, you're gonna have to assume a value theory. You're gonna have to assume that there is this sort of set of values that God is constrained by, and then if God violates those, sets, then that would sort of falsify theism, right? Because on theism, God can only do good things, right? That's the whole idea. God is all good; He can only do good things. Therefore, given a certain value theory, God can only do what is according to the value theory, right?
Yeah.
But the problem here is that there are a plurality of different value theories, right? There's virtue ethics, there's utilitarianism, there's consequentialism, right? There's deontology. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the problem of evil won't work. It just pointed out here that if God is constrained by, let's say, virtue ethics, right, where God is sort of motivated to sort of produce virtues, right, and if virtues require certain suffering, then it just logically follows that God's going to have to, according to the value theory, going to have to allow for a certain amount of suffering to occur, right?
Yeah.
And I think another consideration here, I'll get more into this when I get into the next point, which is the defeat condition. But the whole idea is that sort of lays out the game, right? Because it's like, okay, well, if you're going to come up with an argument from evil, you're going to say, well, God would create a world that is perfect, right? This is the imperfection argument. Since we live in an imperfect world, and therefore God would not do that, right? And the issue that I see there is that you're going to have to make a lot of assumptions about what is perfect and what's not perfect, right? And you're also going to have to make a lot of assumptions about what type of world are we actually judging here when it comes to what's perfect and what's not perfect, right? And this gets into the problem of what I call incrementability, right? And this basic idea is that there are certain values in our world that you can't really compare to, like, I don't know, the value of like an angelic world or something, right? So you're gonna have this incrementability going on. So it's not like there's this universal set of like, okay, these are like the best values that could occur in any possible state of affairs, and then you have these lower levels. Like, no, I think there are sort of like, they're incrementable. Like, you can't really measure them, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right? And I think so. Given that sort of problem, then and this, I think this is relevant to the shared axiology, because the axiology is also going to sort of have this incrementability issue, right? And there's a good paper by I forgot his name. I think it's Rubio something, but he talks about how any world that God creates, there could always be a better world, right? And a better world and a better world, and it's like, okay, well, you're going to run into this paradox where God just can't create any world, because any world that God creates, God could just create a better one. Right? So in that case, given this sort of axiology there, then there's going to be a circumstance by which, because God cannot create the perfect world because that's just metaphysically impossible, then there's going to be sort of the next best state of actions that God can do is going to be an imperfect world, right?
Yeah.
Now me and Tim, I know in our last rebuttal to Ben Watkins, we sort of pointed this out, and the basic idea here is that there's going to be, because of that incrementability problem, and given this sort of hierarchy of God could just always create the next best world, then you run into this issue where either God creates no world or God creates an imperfect world. And what I mean by imperfect world is that, just to be clear here, that an imperfect world, when I mean that, is that it's incommensurable. So while it is true that God can only create the best world, that best world is going to be incommensurable to some other best world, right? In terms of value, right? Because you can't really measure them, right? And so because of that leaves a lot of that leaves a lot of problems, because I see what a lot of arguments from evil they sort of do is they sort of assume one set of incommensurable values, but then they have to ignore this other set of incommensurable values that God may be, more obligated or more motivated to act by, right? So I hope that helps in terms of the axiology. And then I guess, my next point will probably be more relevant to this. But yeah, so I hope that makes sense. Do you have any questions or concerns?
Yeah. So how similar to be obviously one very common response to the problem of evil is the idea that you can't have evil without good and you can't have good without God. Is this your any similarity to that kind of argument, or would it be a very different kind of response to the problem of evil?
Well, in this sense, it's sort of pointed out that the problem of evil has to assume a sort of incrementable value set, right? So what does that mean? Well, it means that in order to say, okay, well, God could only create the best world or perfect world or whatever. Okay, best according to what? Right? What's the value set that you're using to judge this, right?
Okay.
And the problem is, given a certain value set, then there might be a case, and I think this is the case, where you're just not going to have a world that's perfect, because there can always just be a best world, a better world, relative to that. Right. So in that sense, it's incommensurable, right? You have this incrementability problem, right?
Yeah.
Which is going to really, I think that's going to at least sort of nullify the problem, because any argument from evil is going to have to sort of have that in the background assumption. But given this problem of shared axiology, given the incrementability issues and stuff, then you're automatically, that sort of stops the problem of evil from really having any sort of force, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's great. So thank you. Maybe then let's dive into number 2, which is the idea that God is a unique moral agent.
Yeah. So this one was this objection that me and Tim sort of came up with is a little bit different than the Brian Davies view. So it is similar in many respects, but it's also different. So there's a book by Brian Davies. I think it's called I can't remember the God and the Problem of Evil. I can't remember the exact title because I didn't like it too well. It was not I can agree with some of the motivations behind his arguments, but I was very it's okay, this is not doing too well. But so what Brian Davies is going to say is that that God is not a moral agent at all, right? So God is all good, right? But then, God doesn't really have any obligations whatsoever, right? That's an extreme position, right? And I can sort of understand the classical theist intuition behind that, but what me and Tim have come up with is sort of a middle ground approach where, instead of saying that God has no obligations, right? That's one extreme, the Brian Davies. The other extreme would be that that God is a human moral agent, right? That God is sort of constrained by these ethical human moral conditions, right?
Okay, yeah, I'm tracking with you.
And so the middle part, a good middle ground between those extremes is, I think, the one that me and Tim hold to, which is a sort of that God is a unique moral agent, which means that basically that God has unique moral obligations that only apply to him and nobody else. Now, why is this relevant to the problem of evil? Well, there's a few reasons. So number one is that a lot of arguments from evil sort of assume that God is a unique, or that God is a human moral agent, right? So one example is okay, let's say that like someone's getting murdered, right? It's like, oh, well, wouldn't you want to stop that murder, right? And so because God didn't stop that murder, then therefore, God can't be all good. Well, that argument, that argument actually assumes that God is a human moral agent, right? And the problem is that there's no really good reason for that. So that's an undefended assumption that God is a
Hmm.
human moral agent.
Yeah.
There is one exception though. The only time that I've seen it defended, the only time that I've seen that assumption defended is that well, if we say that God is not a human moral agent, then theism has no explanatory power because we can't explain, why God does certain actions, right?
Yeah.
But I think the way, at least the approach that me and Tim hold to, which is that God is a unique moral agent, I think that bypasses that problem because we're not saying that God has no obligation. So we're not saying that God has no constraints on him, just that his
Hmm.
constraints are sort of unique to him and that they're not going to be purely, meta ethical human
Hmm.
constraints. Basically, I
Hmm.
hope that makes
So it's
sense.
almost like the idea, like you have the skeptical theist that's just gonna say like God's totally unique. Like we have no way of knowing like what he may like do or not do. Maybe like extreme form of skeptical theism. And on the other end, there's people who may say like, well, we totally know what God would and wouldn't do. You guys want to kind of like find like a middle ground? Is that kind of the path
Yeah,
you're trying to go forward with?
yeah, because in fact, on my video on the problem of evil, one of the first things I go over is this distinction. These two extreme camps, right? You have the skeptical theist, which says
Mhm.
God, we can't know anything about why God allows for evil. But then
Yeah.
you also have this dogmatic, what I call dogmatic theism, which is where we can know everything about why God allows for evil, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
what I found is that the best approach, right, is going to be somewhere in the middle, right? It's going to
Okay.
be in between those two extremes. And what is that? Well, it just means that we can have some idea of why God allows for evil, right? We can have some sort of like, aesthetic and moral, what I call meta normative constraints that sort of guide God's actions, right? So we can, theism in that sense has explanatory power because it can sort of explain why we live in this type of world, right? Why God, allows for certain evils, but it's not saying that we can know everything, right?
Hmm.
So in that case, then I think that the cool thing about this approach is that it allows theism to be a research project, which means we're able to learn more about why God allows for evil. So like I admit that right now, like I don't know every single reason why God allows for evil, right? That's a research project, right? We continually learn more about why God, does those certain things. And so yeah, I think what that allows us to do is sort of I think it shows us that theism can sort of be its own research project, right? We can sort
Hmm.
of understand, we can grow our knowledge in why God does certain things, and it can grow our knowledge in just, it can grow our knowledge in like the explanatory power of theism, right?
Yeah.
So that's how I view it. And so now, of course, I do want to sort of get into a little bit here what I think um, what I think God's constraints are, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So one of the constraints is going to be sort of aesthetic constraints, and one of the core principles behind that is what is called the defeat condition. When me and Tim were researching this, we first came across the defeat condition in what's her in Abbott's book, Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God. Um, we also saw, well, that, and then also Trent Dowdery's work on animal suffering. But
Hmm.
the whole principle behind this let me see if I can find it. But so the whole idea behind this principle is that God is authorized to allow evil as long as the evil is defeated within the total existence of whatever evil happens to a creature, right? And I think, let me see if I can find it real quick. So this whole Okay. Okay, here it is. So Adams and John Snyder define evil as this, or defeated evil as this. An evil is defeated when it is integrated as a constructive part of a valuable composable whole that not only outweighs the evil, but could not be as valuable as it is without that evil, right?
Hmm.
So in that instance, the evil sort of remains in the subject, right? But it is defeated, right? And it becomes a sort of a greater composable whole, right? And I think this condition actually, it's sort of, I think what it does is it sort of shows that arguments for evil make this fundamental error where they're gonna, a lot of them, I don't know, I don't know if necessarily all the arguments from evil do this, but what I've seen is that like the vast majority, even Robert Bass's paper on inscrutable evils, he makes the same assumption as well, where it's like, well, God is constrained by the necessity condition, and on the necessity condition, God can only allow evils that are necessary for greater good, right? So there has to be this sort of necessary condition by which, okay, you can only bring about greater goods if that evil, if that greater good would not be possible without the evil, right?
Yeah.
But the problem here is this assumes, this is going to assume human moral conditions on evil, right? It sort of has to ignore this defeat condition idea, right? And so what I think the defeat condition does is it sort of nullifies the argument, right? So what it does is basically, on that sort of view, even especially when we're talking about like, best kind of worlds and stuff like that. What I've seen a lot happen is like the best kind of worlds are going to be worlds where, the good would always sort of outweigh the evil, right? And that, the best world would be like where there's just good, right?
Yeah.
But what this defeat condition does is that it totally changes the game, because it's not about the balancing off, right? It's not that, oh, you only have all good and no evil, but rather there's this defeat idea where the balancing off relation is sort of nullified when we understand that the evil can be sort of part of a larger composable whole of the goodness of the world.
Yeah.
Right. And so this sort of changed the game, because in that sense, then the best world is not going to be a world where you just have all good and no evil, but rather the best world is going to be a world where you have evil, but that evil is sort of part of a greater whole. So it's defeated in that sort of sense. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I'm tracking with you. That's good.
And what this does is this sort of nullifies any argument. Well, it nullifies any logical argument from evil, but it also, I think, nullifies any evidential argument from evil, because a lot of evidential arguments will sort of ignore this fact, and they'll sort of assume what's called the necessity condition, right? And if God is not a human moral agent, then it's going to just nullify any sort of argument, right? So to the point where the probability, like the evidential force that the probable evil has with the defeat condition is going to be zero, right? Now, of course, there is one exception to this, which is if an atheist can show that there are evils that are unredeemable or undefeatable, then I would say that is evidence against theism, right? I'll go so far as to say that is a falsification of theism, right? But the problem is there's no examples of that at all. Like every example of evil that we come up with are defeatable in some sense, right? They're redeemable in some sense, right?
Yeah.
And you can look at this for any evil, like evolutionary evils, teleological evils, any sort of evils, even like the worst, even like horrendous evils, like every single one of those examples. All you have to ask is this evil redeemable? Is this evil defeatable? And if it is, it's not going to have any evidential weight against theism, right? So
yeah,
I hope
I like this kind of approach of where we're looking at this idea of like, well, God is unique, so we can understand like we may not have like all the reasons given like evil, like knowing it now, but knowing like the nature of God, like all evils can and would be redeemed. It's not just like, oh, he might or he may not. Like they will be, like even like the most intense like sufferings of like human beings or animals or whatnot. Like we know like God is a unique moral agent who can also is proof of good, will redeem these things. I think that's super helpful. So yeah, that's a great point. I like that. Anything else you want to say before we go on to number 3?
Not too much, although I think there is one objection that I want to sort of address before we get to the next issue, which is, well, God can create a world where, every evil is just necessary, right? Like why would God, if God has the ability to do, this set of actions, then why wouldn't he do that, right? And my response to that is, well, you seem to be assuming that just because God can do it does not mean he's motivated to do it, right?
Yeah.
Right. So what's important here is that just because God has the ability to do something does not mean that he's not going to have some overriding motivation, right? What matters for theism, what matters for God is not his ability, but rather his motivation to do something, right? So if God has overriding motivations to, allow for defeatable evils, then he will do it, right? If God
Mm-hmm.
has override motivations to do that, if he has sort of like these meta-normative motivations, these aesthetic motivations to pursue that, then that's all that really matters, right? Just because God has the ability to do something else does not mean that he's going to, right? What matters
Mm-hmm.
is the motivations that God has for doing an action, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to, answer that objection, but yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So then the third thing we're going to look at here is this problem of fine-tuned virtues. So let's dive into that a little bit, Kyle.
Yeah, so this one was a little bit tricky because I had to reread. Well, I reread Trent Dowdery's work on this, I think like 3 times, at least that chapter. I think it was
Mm-hmm.
chapter. Well, I forgot which chapter exactly it was. Let's see here. So chapter. Okay, yeah, chapter 7. That's okay, yeah. So chapter 7 was where he sort of presents this argument from. He doesn't necessarily call it fine-tuned virtues, but it's sort of a fine-tuned argument, right? Where this whole idea that in order to have certain virtues, you're going to have a world where there's this sort of narrow range of good and evil states of affairs,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the reason for that is because a logically necessary condition for the display of some of the highest virtues, right? You look at
Yeah.
certain saints, you look at um just generally speaking, like, in order to have certain virtues, you're going to have to go through certain suffering, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
going to have to go through these trials in life, right? One good example is like the defeat of fear, right? In order to have courage, you need to overcome a fear. In order to feel compassion, you have to understand someone's pain. In order to forgive somebody, someone had to do a bad action against you, right? So these sort of things, I mean, there's plenty of examples of virtues, right? But my point here is that these virtues cannot exist without suffering, without evil, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
um and the whole point of this is that you have to have a sort of limited range of evil, right? Because on naturalism, when you compare with naturalism, there is no like constraint. There is no value sort of, and we'll go more into this in my next objection. But there's no constraint on what naturalism can allow when it comes to evil, right? You could have a world where everything's going good. You could have a world where everything's going bad, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
no constraint there. The only time where naturalism actually has an advantage is going to be when theism doesn't have an advantage. So basically, when theism makes a false prediction, right? And we'll get more into that on the next problem. But this problem of fine-tuning virtues, I think what it shows is that naturalism makes no predictions about the fine-tuned range of virtues, right? So I don't even think naturalism predicts that there are going to be virtues at all, right?
Yeah.
And that's a huge problem because in order for there to be virtues, you need to have a fine-tuned range of good and evil suffering. But
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't seem to me like you could actually, at least on naturalism, you're not going to like expect this sort of thing to occur,
Yeah.
right?
Okay,
I hope that makes
that's
sense.
super great. I think one of the things, and I think it's going to overlap a little bit with your next theodicy, but it's helpful for me, like thinking about the problem of evil. And one of the ways to really help me is thinking about like, well, maybe like theism, like just grant for a second that like, well, theism really doesn't have any explanation for like why the state of affairs is this way rather than this way. Well, it seems like naturalism or atheism have the same exact problem. Like, there's no reason given atheism that we have like this world versus a world of like maybe like 5 like hydrogen atoms floating around, or maybe like protons and neutrons are sticking together, or really any other like state of affairs. So I think it's a super
Yeah.
helpful thing when you're looking at the problem of evil is to really think about like, well, given naturalism, would we expect a world like this? And it just seems very unlikely as well, even if you were going to say that like theism was in the same boat. So yeah.
Yeah, because one of the things that I sort of noticed is like even if this sort of world is unlikely on theism, well, how is it more likely on naturalism? Like
Exactly. Yeah.
where is that going to play into there? And I think one of the issues I think a lot of people don't understand is even if it's like 1% probability that we're going to live in this type of universe on theism, as long as that's higher than on naturalism, so like let's say if it's 0.5% on naturalism, versus 1% on theism. Well, theism's going to have like double the advantage,
Yeah.
right?
And the
Even when you have
problem's
like
honestly probably a lot worse for naturalists. Like there's a lot more than like 200 different universes that could have existed. So I think it's going
yeah.
to be a lot worse for them.
Yeah. So, this whole idea of fine-tuned virtues, I think that fine-tuned virtues are sort of that's actually evidence for theism, right? So in order to achieve the highest virtues, in order to display them and act upon them, you're going to have this sort of world where there's a certain range of suffering, right? Now, again, it doesn't exactly predict, right? Theism doesn't exactly predict you're going to have this amount of suffering, right? But there is still going to be a range there, right, when it comes to this. And I
Yeah.
think the issue there is on naturalism, you don't expect any of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas on theism, I think you do. I think you do expect virtues to play out, right? I think that. So yeah, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think it's going to kind of get into this fourth and final problem that we're going to talk about today, which is the problem of value mapping and theodicy.
So this is actually So this final problem I think is actually probably the most consequential for the problem of evil. I think that not only does this problem sort of nullify, so not only does it, I think, refute the problem totally, but I think it actually reverses it, right? And
Yeah.
this is, I think, it's very simple, to point out here. There's a few considerations. So I call this the problem of value mapping in theodicy, right? So for theism, there's a good and good mapping from God's nature to a state of affairs, right? So you have God is all good, right? So then God would sort of actualize or allow for a good state of affairs to occur, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is interesting because what this concludes is that any good state of affairs would be evidence for theism, right? You could sort of
Yeah.
expect, okay, if God is all good and there's a good state of affairs, well, why did this state of affairs occur? Well, because God is all good, right? You can sort of
Yeah.
link that there. You could sort of predict that on the hypothesis, right? But for naturalism, you don't have that, right? So on naturalism, you don't have a good to good mapping from an indifferent universe, right,
Mm-hmm.
to a state of affairs, right, or at least a good state of affairs, right? And the reason for this is because there's no value mechanism to sort of, you know, um, tell you, why would you expect this state of affairs versus another state of affairs, right?
Yeah.
And so this leads to the conclusion, of course, that there is no set of good or bad states of affairs that could be evidence of naturalism, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
in order for naturalism to actually have the advantage, right, and this is something that Paul Draper sort of does, where basically it has to rely on theism making false predictions. So like even if naturalism may not exactly predict the data of evil, right, even if it doesn't exactly predict that there's going to be like this sort of high range of suffering,
Yeah.
the argument is that theism predicts the opposite, right? So theism would predict, one example is like, okay, well, theism's going to predict a perfect world. Theism's going to predict that there's only good states of affairs. Theism's going to, I
Mm-hmm.
guess you could say like basically theism predicts a bed of roses, right?
Yeah.
And so the argument is that, well, because theism makes a false prediction, right? Then at least on naturalism you sort of have the advantage, right? Because at least there it's sort of epistemically friendly, or at least evil is sort of epistemically friendly to naturalism, right? Or at least
Mm-hmm.
more epistemically friendly. However, this leads to a huge problem, right? So the problem is that the moment that theism uses a theodicy to explain, why we have a certain distribution of good and evil, naturalism is actually at a disadvantage, right? Because it doesn't have any sort of value mechanism. It doesn't have what I call value mapping in order to explain any sort of day of evil. Whereas what theism does is it allows for a sort of groundwork for such a mapping to be possible. What does this mean? Well, it means that given a sort of theodicy, right, theism imposes some limitations on the upper and lower bounds of the distribution of good and evil, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so what theism does is it actually allows you to at least have some bare minimum explanatory account of why there is good and evil in the first place, why there is
Yeah.
the set of good and evil in the first place. But naturalism doesn't do any of that, right? So
Mm-hmm.
naturalism does not give you any idea of why there's evil and suffering in the world, right?
Yeah.
The only time that naturalism has the advantage, again, the only time that has the advantage is if you say, well, theism just predicts, a bed of roses, right, or something. But of course, as a theist, I would disagree with that, given given the fact that I think that God is a unique moral agent, that God would sort of allow for defeatable evils and stuff like that. And I think that at least the theodicy that I've been, well, I'm still working on it, but at least I have most of it out, which is basically what I call the evolving worlds theodicy. I did a video on it a while back.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the idea is that God sort of is going to create an evolving world, right? And I don't know if you want me to get into that or not, if you want to get into my theodicy or not, but yeah, I do provide a sort of theodicy that sort of accounts, right, for
Yeah.
the distribution of good and evil states,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. Maybe save
So
the Odyssey for another day. Because we're looking at
yeah,
these
that's
four
fine.
major problems. Maybe we could even do another conversation because this is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So we talked about these four big things, and one thing I just want to like reaffirm for people listening and viewing is like this showing like this big problem of like naturalism and explaining evil. Like say that like you looked at like a specific evil and you're like, well, there's like a 1 in a million chance that like theism could explain this evil. Well, you think about naturalism. Well, naturalism is gonna have to do better than 1 in a million. And if I think about the way of like possible worlds, it seems like there's a lot more than a million possible ways these things could have gone given naturalism. If that's the
Right.
case, theism still is the better explanation of this, even if it's like a really poor one in your view.
Yeah.
It's one of the big problems for naturalism that we've been emphasizing is that what really does naturalism better predict than theism? Because it's really hard to see. Yeah, it's just hard to see.
Yeah, because I think that a lot of the times when these debates sort of, especially with the Odyssey, right? So um with the Theodicy, the explanation for why there's evil on naturalism is like, well, the universe is indifferent, right? But then it's
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, well, how would an indifferent universe get you like any sort of states of affairs where there's good or bad or good or bad states of affairs, right? So what I meant to say is like, okay, one example is like, well, one explanation of evil on naturalism is like, well, the universe is indifferent, okay, that's fine, right? That's an explanation. But the moment that, you know, theism sort of imposes the limitations of the evil, like, so one example is the defeat condition, right? So if God can allow evils to be defeated, right, then that's going to automatically provide a better account than naturalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or God allows evil so that we can grow virtue. Okay, well, that's going to also provide a better account than on naturalism, right? It's not all clear to me why naturalism actually explains evil better than theism, at least given a theodicy like that. So, again, I don't want to get too much into theodicy, but I
Mm-hmm.
just want to point out here that you do have this problem of value mapping. So you do have this issue of, you get to from God to a good state of affairs, but on naturalism you don't get that, right? So there's going to be some tension in the probability space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Kyle. Is there anything else you want to say with regards to like the problem of evil and what we've been laying out here before we wrap up today? Because we obviously
Yeah.
covered
So,
ground.
one of the things I mentioned in the beginning was, my conclusion about, the problem of evil not being a problem for theism, right? And as a theist, right? So as a theist now, I was hesitant to accept that conclusion, and I had to be honest. And I'm not trying to like be like, oh yeah, you're just being super biased. You're just trying to like support your prior position. But I had to change my position, especially in relation to like how God actually does his actions, right? So I had to like rethink my view of theism a lot and like why God does certain actions over others, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it took a while for me to sort of get to grasp that concept, um but yeah, it was a journey. And even right now I'm still sort of, even though I'm not really focusing on the problem of evil too much, you know I still read it sometimes, especially like one example, just briefly. I was rereading Gregory Dawes's book on theism and explanation. And I don't agree with him on a lot of stuff, but I do agree that, at least if you're going with the whole idea that God is a human moral agent, I think you're going to have a lot of problems there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, one of the things that he goes over is, that God, he sort of tries to show that theism. Well, I think what he tries to show is that theism has low explanatory power, right? And I think the way that he
Yeah.
does this is that he's going to assume, well, God wants to minimize suffering. Like he just says that outright. Like I can't remember exactly what page he says that on, but he just says it. Well, God's just going to minimize suffering, right? So like from the very beginning, like, okay, well, if you're going to say, well, God just must minimize suffering, and if I don't agree with that as a theist, then any sort of argument that you come up with about why theism has low explanatory power is not going to work, right? So in my mind, it sort of changed the way that I saw a lot of these atheological arguments, right? And a lot of atheist, literature on this, because once you have the defeat condition in your mind, once you have that, and once you have the idea that God is a unique moral agent and all this stuff, then it's sort of like you can sort of filter out a lot of the arguments that you see in the atheist on the atheist side, right? So whenever I read any argument from evil paper now, I just check, okay, what axiological assumptions are they using, right? And most of the time, like it's going to be either the necessity condition, or it's going to be another condition, which is the minimized suffering condition, which is what Gregory Dowses did. And I'm just like, well, if you're using assumptions that I don't agree with, then why should I take your argument into consideration, right? So yeah,
it's been super helpful, and it's definitely something I need to re-listen to, because I haven't studied the depth of the problem of evil as well as you and Tim have. But I hope for people listening that it's like kind of helps you like explore and think about these things, because really all these arguments are a lot more complex than oftentimes they're made out to be, and especially the problem of evil. So yeah, thanks Kyle for helping and clarifying things and shedding light on things.
One last thing before we close off, there are 4 books that I would recommend every theist read. So the first one, of course, is going to be the one by Marilyn McAdams, right? This really helped me a lot in understanding these concepts. Then, of course, Richard Swinburne. I think it is pretty well on natural evil. And then the 2 biggest ones are going to be John Hick, right? He comes up with the soul building theodicy. And then probably the best one, in my opinion, is going to be the one by Trent Dowdery. This is like, honestly, I don't know any other better book on the problem of evil than this one. So at least on the theistic side, I would recommend that stuff. So yeah.
Well, right on, Kyle. Thank you so much for coming on today. Your channel, Christian Idealism, is just added in this description. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Hope you enjoyed this discussion. I did a lot. And thank you to everyone who tunes in and listens. Super grateful for you and your support. If you value the show, become a patron at patreon.com/Apologetics. But that's it. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much, and God bless.